standing at the edge of our dock when I saw them through the window of the boathouse. My wife of 38 years and my best friend since grade 11. I don't know how long I stood there. Could have been 30 seconds, could have been 5 minutes. My coffee mug was still in my hand, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should set it down before I dropped it. That was the only thought my brain could produce. Set down the mug, Gerald. Set down the mug. I set it down on the dock railing. I walked back to the main cottage. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. The lake was quiet that morning. It's always quiet on Thanksgiving weekend up at Muskoka. That particular stillness you only get in October. The summer crowds have gone and the loons have mostly headed south and the birches have turned that shade of gold that makes you feel, even in the best of times, like something is ending. I'd always loved it up here. 31 years we'd owned this property, my wife Sandra and I. Bought it the year our son was born. We used to joke that it was the best decision we ever made. Better even than the house in Oakville. Because up here we could actually breathe. I wasn't breathing particularly well right now. His name was Doug. Doug Mercer. We'd been friends since 1981, since the 11th grade at Lawn Park Secondary. Since we were both 17 years old and terrible at gym class, and better than we had any right to be at playing guitar. We'd been in each other's weddings. I was the first person he called when his father died. He was the first person I called when I thought I had cancer. Turned out to be nothing. A benign cyst, but for 3 weeks I didn't tell anyone except Doug. That's the kind of friend he was. That's the kind of friend I thought he was. Our kids grew up together. His daughter Claire and our son Matthew were in the same class for 6 years running. Christmas Eves at their place, summers at the lake. 40 years of birthday dinners and hockey games and long drives back from the LCBOY with a case of blue in the backseat. 40 years. I kept sitting at that kitchen table. I could hear, distantly, the sound of the boathouse door. They didn't know I'd come back early from my walk. I turned around at the halfway point because my knee was giving me trouble again. The same knee I'd been ignoring since March. And I thought I'd come back and sit on the dock with my coffee and watch the mist burn off the water. That was the plan. That was supposed to be a perfectly ordinary Thanksgiving morning. I heard footsteps on the path. Then the screen door opened and Sandra came in. And she looked at me. And I think she knew immediately that something had changed, though she couldn't have known exactly what, because she said, "You're back early. Is your knee okay?" Her voice was completely normal. After 38 years, I still couldn't tell. "Fine," I said. "Just tired." She poured herself a coffee. She stood at the counter. She asked if I wanted pancakes. "Sure," I said. "Pancakes." I watched her move around the kitchen. The woman I'd married at 26 in a church in Mississauga on a day so hot the flowers wilted during the ceremony. The woman who'd held my hand in the hospital when Matthew was born. The woman who'd driven 4 hours through a February ice storm to get to her mother's bedside. I was watching her like I was watching a stranger, trying to reconcile what I'd seen through that window with the person standing 3 feet away from me clacking eggs into a bowl, and I couldn't do it. My mind kept sliding off the problem like a hand sliding off wet ice. Matthew came down from the loft around 9. He was 33 now, my son. Worked in commercial real estate in Toronto. Broad-shouldered like I used to be, before everything south of my neck decided to migrate slightly downward. He had Sandra's eyes, and my stubbornness, and a laugh that filled whatever room he was in. He poured himself a coffee and stole a piece of bacon off the plate and got a look from his mother that hadn't changed since he was 8 years old. Doug came in about 20 minutes later. He said good morning. He sat down across from me and talked about whether the Leafs had any hope this season. His assessment was no, mine was also no. This is something we have agreed on for approximately 30 consecutive years. And I sat there and nodded and said the right words and thought about how his hand had been on my wife's waist in that boathouse. How it hadn't looked like something that was just beginning. That was the thing. That was the thing I couldn't stop turning over. It hadn't looked new. I didn't say anything that weekend. I know some people reading this or listening to this, I suppose, will think that was cowardly. Maybe it was, but I've never been someone who acts before he thinks. And I had a full cottage of people and a 4-hour drive back to Oakville and a knee that was genuinely getting worse, and mostly I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I said a word. Doug's wife Karen was there too, their daughter Claire, my granddaughter, 6 years old, who called me Grandpa Jerry and had fallen asleep in my arms twice that weekend while I read her stories about a bear who lost his hat. I drove home on the Monday. Sandra sat in the passenger seat and played a podcast about the history of the Byzantine Empire, which she'd been working through for 3 months, and I drove and said nothing, and the trees along the 400 were absolutely on fire with color, and I thought, I have to find out how long this has been going on. I have a friend, not a close friend, more of an acquaintance from my old firm, who does insurance investigations. He had mentioned once at a dinner party, in that way people do when they want you to know what they do without exactly bragging about it, that the tools available now for this kind of thing were remarkable. Phones. Location data. I'd filed that away the way you file away information you hope you never need. I called him Tuesday morning from my car in the driveway of my own house. Engine running because I didn't want to be inside while I made this particular call. He was sympathetic in a professional way. He told me what to look for. He also told me gently that sometimes what you find is worse than what you suspected, and that I should be prepared for that. I said I understood. It took me 3 weeks to understand how thoroughly I had not understood. I won't go into all of it. I'll say that there were credit card statements I hadn't paid close enough attention to. I handle the investments. Sandra handles the day-to-day accounts. An arrangement we'd had for 15 years that I now realized had been spectacularly naive of me. I'll say that there were afternoons accounted for that shouldn't have been. I'll say that when I finally went back through the last 2 years with the particular attention you give to something, once you know what you're looking for, I found evidence of something that had been running parallel to my actual life, just underneath the surface, like a river under ice. 2 years, at minimum. There was a specific day in September 2 autumns ago, when I had driven up to Muskoka alone for a long weekend to do some repairs on the dock. Sandra said she couldn't get away from work. I thought nothing of it at the time. I'd spent 3 days up there alone with a toolbox and a radio, quite happily, and called her every evening, and she'd asked about the dock, and I'd told her about the dock. That weekend, according to what I now found, she and Doug had stayed at a hotel in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I sat with that for a long time. Here's the thing they don't tell you about this kind of discovery. It doesn't just change what you feel about the present. It reaches back and relights things. Every memory you have gets a question mark attached to it. Every business trip, every evening she came home tired, every moment she seemed distracted or distant or somewhere else, and you'd put it down to work or worry or just the ordinary exhaustion of being 63 years old. All of it becomes evidence to re-examine. You start to feel like you've been living in a house and not realizing the foundation was different from what you thought. And the longer it goes on, the more you understand that what you're grieving isn't just what's happening now. You're grieving the past too, a version of the past that may not have existed the way you remember it. I talked to Matthew once during this period, carefully, without telling him anything. We had dinner at a restaurant on Bloor, just the two of us, which we tried to do every month or so. He knew something was wrong. He asked me twice if I was okay, and I said I was fine, just tired, the knee, the usual. He didn't push. But when we were putting on our coats to leave, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad, if something's going on, I'm here." Just that. Nothing more. I almost told him everything right then in the coat check of an Italian restaurant on Bloor Street. I didn't. I told him I knew. I told him I'd let him know if I needed anything. He held my shoulder for another moment and then let go. And we walked out into the October cold. And I drove home. The thing that forced my hand was the Christmas party. Every year, the Mercers host a Christmas party at their house in Port Credit. They've done it for 20-something years running. It's a genuine institution. 60 or 70 people crowded into their house on the second Saturday of December with Karen's butter tarts and Doug's mulled wine and a rotating cast of neighbors and old colleagues and people from the kids' schools. Sandra and I have gone every single year except 2020. We brought wine and stayed too late and driven home singing along to the radio. I was looking at the invitation on the kitchen counter. Karen had sent actual paper invitations. She always did. And I thought about walking into that house, about standing there with a glass of mulled wine Doug had made and watching him talk to my wife while Karen refilled the butter tart plate. And I thought, I cannot do this. I cannot walk into that house and pretend. But I also thought about Karen who had been Sandra's friend since the kids were small. Karen who had no idea, or at least I was fairly certain she had no idea. Karen who deserved to know what was happening in her own marriage. I called Matthew. I drove to his condo in Liberty Village and I sat down on his couch and I told him everything. I watched his face go through something I hope I never have to watch again. That particular expression when something you couldn't have imagined becomes real, and you have to rapidly restructure everything you thought you knew. He didn't say anything for a long time. He asked me if I was sure. I told him I was sure. He got up and walked to his kitchen window and stood there for a while looking out at the street. Then he said something that I didn't expect. He said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." He came back and sat down. He'd been noticing things for about 6 months, he said. Nothing definitive, nothing he could have brought to me, but small things. The way Doug's hand lingered when he hugged Sandra goodbye at family gatherings. A moment at the Thanksgiving weekend at the lake. The same weekend, it turned out, that I had seen them through the boathouse window. When Matthew had been coming down the path from the main cottage and seen them come out of the boathouse together, not touching, but something in their manner that had struck him as wrong. He had told himself he was imagining it. He had told himself there was no way. He'd been carrying that since Thanksgiving. We sat in his condo for 3 hours that night. By the end of it, we had agreed on what we were going to do. I want to be clear about something. This was not about spectacle. It was not about embarrassing anyone in public or creating a scene or being dramatic. I'm 63 years old. I'm a retired civil engineer from Mississauga who has coached recreational hockey and served on my neighborhood association's board of directors and driven the same make-off car for 4 consecutive decades because I find familiarity comforting. I'm not a dramatic person. I never have been. But Matthew made a point that I kept coming back to. He said, if you confront them alone, in private, they will deny it. They will minimize it. They will manage the conversation and manage your reaction, and you will come away with nothing but their version of events. If Karen doesn't hear it directly, she can be kept in the dark indefinitely. And Sandra and Doug will have the opportunity to get their story straight before anyone else knows anything at all. The Christmas party was 2 weeks away. I need to tell you about the morning of the party, because this is the part I think about most now. I was standing in the bathroom getting ready, and Sandra was doing her makeup at the mirror, and I was watching her in the reflection the way I'd gotten used to watching her over the past 2 months. This constant, strange duality of seeing the person you know and the person you've been discovering. And she looked up and caught my eye in the mirror and smiled. The smile she always gives me when she catches me looking at her. After 38 years, the same smile. "Big night," she said. "Yep," I said. "I was thinking we could leave around 11. I have yoga in the morning." "Sure," I said. 11. I drove us there. We parked on the street in front of the Mercer's house, and I could see the windows lit up and hear the sound of the party from the driveway. That particular sound of 60 people talking and laughing all at once. A sound I had loved for over 20 years. And now it sat in my chest like something cold. Matthew was already there. We'd arranged it. He texted me when we pulled up, "I'm inside. Karen's in the kitchen. Ready when you are." Sandra rang the doorbell. Doug answered. He looked genuinely happy to see us, which was the thing that hit me hardest. Not that I expected guilt written on his face, but some part of me had apparently still been hoping for it. Some visible sign, some crack in the performance. There was nothing. He hugged Sandra. He shook my hand. He said, "Jerry, the mulled wine's on the stove. Help yourself. You know where everything is." I did know where everything was. I'd been coming to this house for over 20 years. "I do," I said. We went inside. I won't describe the first hour in detail because it was an ordinary Christmas party, and that ordinariness was its own particular kind of cruelty. I talked to people I knew. I held my mulled wine. I watched the clock on the mantel. At 9:15, Matthew appeared at my elbow and said quietly, "Karen's sitting down in the living room. Most people have moved to the dining room. Now's probably the time." I set my wine glass down on the side table. I walked into the living room. Karen was sitting on the sofa with 2 women I didn't know well. Neighbors, I thought, and when she saw me, she started to smile, the hostess smile, and I said, "Karen, I'm sorry to interrupt. I need to speak with you and Doug for a moment. It's important." Something in my voice. She excused herself from the other women and stood up and called across the room for Doug, who came over with a slightly puzzled look. And Sandra was there too now. She'd followed me, sensed something. And the 4 of us were standing together at the edge of the living room while the party continued in the next room. And I thought for just a moment about the dock at Muskoka on a cold October morning and a coffee mug I'd almost dropped. I said, "Karen, I've found evidence that Sandra and Doug have been having an affair for at least 2 years. I have documentation. I'm not here to make a scene, but I couldn't let you go on not knowing, and I couldn't let this continue. The room didn't go quiet. Only the four of us had heard. The party noise from the dining room covered it, which was something I thought about. I thought about Karen's dignity. I thought about not doing this in a way that turned her humiliation into entertainment for 60 people. Sandra said my name. Doug said, Jerry. Karen didn't say anything. She looked at Doug, and the look on her face told me, with absolute certainty, that somewhere underneath everything she already knew, in the way you can know something for a long time before you're willing to know it. Matthew was standing in the doorway. He had come to be there, not to say anything, just to be there. And when I glanced at him, he gave me a small nod. I left the party. Matthew drove me home. We sat in my driveway for a while. The street was quiet. One of my neighbors still had their Halloween decorations up, a foam skeleton tied to their front porch railing, which felt like exactly the right level of absurd for the occasion. I told him I was okay. He said he was going to stay anyway. We went inside and he made tea. Neither of us are big tea people, but it seemed like the right gesture. And we sat at the kitchen table and he told me about a client he'd been dealing with who was making his life difficult. This ordinary work story, and I was grateful for it. Grateful for the normality of it. For the reminder that life would continue to have ordinary things in it. Sandra called twice. I didn't answer. She came home around midnight. Matthew was still there asleep on the couch, and I was sitting in the kitchen. She stood in the doorway and we looked at each other and I said, You should sleep in the guest room tonight. She said, Gerald, please let me explain. Not tonight, I said. Not with Matthew here. Tomorrow. She went to the guest room. I sat at the kitchen table until about 2 in the morning, and then I went to bed and, somewhat to my own surprise, I slept. I want to skip forward now, because the weeks that followed were what you'd expect, and I don't see much use in documenting every conversation and every silence and every moment of sitting across from a lawyer and watching 38 years get organized into a set of legal documents. My lawyer was a woman named Patricia, recommended by a colleague. Efficient and kind in a way that didn't feel contradictory, which I appreciated. The house in Oakville went on the market in February. I'd always said I wanted to move closer to Matthew anyway. I found a townhouse in once, walking distance to a good coffee shop and a hardware store, and a park where I started going in the mornings when my knee would let me. Karen called me once, about 3 weeks after the party. She thanked me for telling her. She said she needed time but that she didn't regret knowing. I told her I was sorry it had happened. I meant it. She and Sandra had been friends for 25 years. There were casualties to the story beyond just me. Doug called once too. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. I deleted it without listening to it. That probably says something about where I was at the time and where I still am, if I'm honest. The hardest moment, and this surprised me, because I'd thought the hardest moment was the boathouse, or the Christmas party, or the first morning alone in the Roncesvalles townhouse. The hardest moment was actually in March, when I was unpacking boxes and I found a photograph from our 25th anniversary trip to Tofino. Both of us standing on the beach at Long Beach, which is one of the most beautiful stretches of coastline in the country. Wind taking Sandra's hair sideways, both of us laughing at something I can no longer remember. I'd forgotten we had that picture. I sat on the floor of my new living room and held it for a long time. I still have it. I put it in a box in the closet, not in the garbage. That felt like the honest thing to do. The Muskoka property. We agreed I would keep it. Sandra had never loved it the way I did. She liked it well enough, but it had always been my place. The place I went to feel like myself, and she acknowledged that without a fight. That surprised me. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe after 38 years, there are some things you know about a person even when everything else has come undone. Matthew and I went up in May. First weekend warm enough to be worth it. Opened up the cottage. Checked the dock. My repairs from that long solo weekend 2 autumns ago had held up fine. Put the kayaks back in the water. Sat on the porch in the evening with beers watching the light change on the lake. His girlfriend came up the second night and the 3 of us made dinner together and I watched them in my kitchen. The easy way they moved around each other and felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Something like peace. Not the absence of grief, but something alongside it. The 2 things existing at the same time which I'd been told was possible but hadn't entirely believed. It's possible. My knee has mostly cooperated since the surgery in January. I walk the park most mornings now, the one in Roncesvalles, and I have a coffee shop I go to after. A small Portuguese place on the corner where they know my order and don't make me repeat it. I've started playing guitar again for the first time in 15 years. Badly, in my living room. at a volume my neighbors have not yet complained about. I'm not all right every day. Some days the anger comes back sharp. Some days the grief. Some days I drive past the kind of restaurant Sandra and I used to go to on anniversaries and I feel the loss of the whole 38 years like a physical weight. That's honest. I think you should know that. But I go to the lake, I sit on the dock. The mornings up there in October, the light on the water, the birches going gold. It still does the thing it always did. I can still breathe up there. That doesn't belong to anything that was taken from me. That's still mine. Here's to that. Here's to what's still yours, whatever that is, wherever you find it. Don't let anyone take you so far from yourself that you forget what it feels like to breathe. I think about Doug sometimes when I'm on the dock in the early morning. Not with the anger I carried through that first winter. That's mostly gone now. Or at least it doesn't have the same sharp edge. What I think about is the 40 years. The actual weight of 40 years of friendship and what it means that something like this could exist inside it, running under me, and I never knew. There's a version of this story where I stay ignorant, where I turn around on that October morning before I reach the boathouse window, where my knee feels fine and I keep walking, where I never make the call from my driveway, never sit at Matthew's kitchen table, never say what I said at the Mercer's Christmas party. That version of the story exists. I almost lived it. What I've come to understand, and this took me longer than I'd like to admit, is that knowing was always going to be better than not knowing. Not easier, not less painful, but better. There's a kind of integrity in facing what's true even when what's true is the last thing you want. I didn't feel particularly courageous standing in that living room in Port Credit. I felt sick and exhausted and old in a way I hadn't felt before. But I did it anyway, because the alternative was to keep building my life on a foundation I now knew was wrong, and I couldn't do that. Some things, once you see them, you can't unsee. Matthew taught me something through all of this that I don't think he knows he taught me. He carried what he suspected at Thanksgiving for 2 months without saying a word. Not because he was avoiding it, but because he was being careful. He was waiting until he had something solid, waiting until the moment was right, protecting me from a half-truth that might have done more damage than good. That's a kind of wisdom I didn't have at 33. Maybe I didn't fully have it at 63 either. But watching him made me want to. And Karen. I think about Karen too. The phone call she made 3 weeks after the party, the steadiness in her voice when she said she didn't regret knowing, that took something real. It takes a particular kind of strength to thank the person who brought your world apart. To recognize that the dismantling of something false is still, in some essential way, a gift. She didn't have to do that. She did it anyway. I'm not the same person I was the morning I walked back from that dock with an empty coffee mug. I don't think I'm worse, though I'm not going to pretend I'm straightforwardly better either. I'm more careful now about what I assume, more attentive to the small things I used to let slide past without examination. And I'm more honest. With Matthew. With the few friends I've told. With myself in the quiet of the Roncesvalles townhouse at 2 in the morning when sleep won't come. The lake is still the lake. That's what I keep coming back to. 31 years of mornings on that dock and it still does the same thing to me. The mist, the birches, that particular quality of light. Whatever was taken from me, that wasn't. I still get to have that. You don't get to choose what happens to you. You get to choose what you do with what's true.